Well, Yoon Suk Yeol was a public prosecutor who campaigned on cracking down on corruption, but he's been mired in political scandals himself. In January, he scrapped a bill that would have ordered an investigation into his wife. She'd been accused of stock manipulation. In July, his wife was questioned over accepting a Dior handbag as a gift in violation of South Korean anti-corruption laws. And in October, local media leaked the phone call of a founder of a polling agency who's boasting of his influence over the president's choice of candidate in by-elections held in 2022. Robert Kelly is a professor of international relations at Pusan National University. He's based in South Korea, but he's joining us now from the US state of Ohio. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. What does the immediate future hold, do you think, for Yoon Suk Yeol?
I think he'll almost certainly be forced to resign in the next week, perhaps two. I would be shocked if he can hold on. This is an enormous breach of South Korea's constitutional democratic norms. South Korea has been a democracy since 1987. There's really been nothing like this in South Korean history, even when North Korea has sort of shelled South Korean targets and things like that. There's never been a declaration of martial law. If he doesn't resign, he'll be impeached. I just can't see him staying in office. The popular explosion response will be just enormous, I think.
The speed at which this decision was originally made took people by surprise. The speed at which it was shut down was equally amazing. Talk to us about the kind of the context of this. Why do you think that Yoon Suk Yeol may have thought that this was actually a good thing to do?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the things that people are really kind of shocked about, right? I think the South Korean media is still really grappling with this. Yoon has had a tough presidency, and President Yoon has had a difficult presidency insofar as the opposition party has the majority in the legislature, and they have been fighting him sort of tooth and nail, somewhat excessively to my mind. I think Yoon's concerns are genuine, that they've made it difficult for him to govern. Most recently on the passage of the budget, and there have been investigations into Yoon's wife, which apparently has affected him quite deeply. He's actually quite sensitive on this point, apparently, and some of his ministers and cabinet appointees and other appointees in the bureaucracy have been sort of, again, I think, kind of hounded, if you will, by the legislature. But obviously, this is a vastly disproportionate response. But it looks like his concerns were basically bureaucratic, which is kind of a shockingly sort of minor issue for which to declare martial law over. But it looks like that's what it was.
What's your assessment of the position in the military in this? And the reason I ask, I've seen stories where the Army's chief of staff had apparently, in accordance with military rule, had declared a ban on all political activities, the imposition of military control on all news media and publications. But that was almost largely ignored. One would imagine, of course, that there are senior members of the military who have lived through the 1980s and are aware of what happened then. What's your assessment of where the military stands in this?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of investigation of that, right? Because, you can't have martial law unless the military is on board, and at least there was some of that, right? You can go on YouTube and see South Korean military helicopters landing on the fields right next to the National Assembly building. It's really kind of shocking to see that in Korea. It's not clear yet, who was responsible and who Yoon thought he could rely on in this. I would be pretty surprised if he hadn't at least contacted police and military, at least at the higher levels, to see if anybody would go along with this. But South Korea's, it's weird, right? Because South Korea's military has traditionally been pretty robustly under civilian control, right? So for example, 7 years ago, a South Korean president was impeached and the military was never called out. There weren't riots in the streets. The police weren't beating people up with truncheons. There wasn't any of that. We went through this 8-month impeachment process and there was no street violence or anything like that at all. So it's kind of shocking, right? I would be surprised if this reached down deeply into the military, which I think is one of the reasons why it fell apart so fast. But it's really not clear yet just how deeply involved in this the military was. I
want to ask you about the structure of the administration and the political party as well. Yoon's chief of staff and his chief secretary, as well as apparently the entire presidential secretariat, have offered to resign. But what is interesting, one of my colleagues was pointing this out to me earlier on, was the timing at which they did that. They didn't do it after the initial call for martial law. They did it after the demand for martial law had been lifted. Does that tell us anything about the feeling towards this decision within the political structure?
Yeah, I would be surprised if Yoon hadn't done at least a little bit of preparation for this, that he had consulted a few of the sort of top members to have a sense that people would come along with this, with him on this. But I mean, there is also sort of like circulating now in the South Korean media, so all these rumors that this was impulsively done, that maybe Yoon had been drinking, right? I mean, it's that this is starting to look like it was fantastically inept, right? I mean, he didn't seem to grasp that the National Assembly almost certainly wouldn't vote for this. And then what was he going to do? I mean, was he going to lock them up? Because the National Assembly is required to validate the martial law declaration, which is, of course, what happened, and they turned it down. But I mean, I would imagine that some of these cabinet ministers, cabinet officials were involved in it, because, I mean, Yoon can't, he can't act on his own. So again, there's probably some kind of complicity, but that's got to be investigated, and it's going to be hugely controversial. There's going to be protests. Yoon's probably going to have to resign first. That's where a lot of the focus of the ire will be in the coming weeks, is to get Yoon himself out of the office if he doesn't quit in the next few days.
Robert, I want to ask you just very briefly, because I'm kind of watching the clock here,
Sure.
but in terms of how other countries are going to react to this, obviously South Korea widely regarded as a stable ally of Western governments. Obviously, there are tensions with North Korea. Just very briefly talk to us about how, say, North Korea and the West are going to be reacting to this.
Yeah, well, the North Koreans will definitely celebrate this as an example of how democracy doesn't work, right? I mean, every time you sort of like see riots, for example, in like the Taiwanese parliament, the Chinese go off and say, look, our system is superior. The North Koreans will do the same. I would be pretty amazed if the Americans had actually, and South Korea's other democratic partners, had gone along with anything remotely like a coup. That's one of the other things that kind of baffles me about this. Yoon Suk Yeol didn't do any kind of preparation at all, because global opinion, liberal democratic opinion, would have been just biting, right? What was he going to do? I mean, did he expect the Americans to agree to this? Right. And so I would imagine that's one of the reasons why it fell apart so quickly, right? You can imagine those MPs were like, oh my God, if we do this, all of our partners are going to abandon us. We're kind of on our own. So again, it just looks fantastically inept. And I hate to say that, but it looks like this was just kind of thrown together in the last few days. And they hadn't really thought this through, because, as you say, the liberal community of states in the world would almost certainly reject this move.
Robert, we appreciate it as always. Thank you, Robert Kelly. Thank you very much indeed.
For having me. Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.